All right, here we go, week 7. And we've hit the turning point in Ecclesiastes. Up until now, Koheleth, our narrator, has given us what you might consider a sequence of anecdotes, things that are easily clumped together in themes, like his exploration of the values of different life choices, if you will, wisdom, self-indulgence, achievement, religion. It gets harder after this point, but to group things, because at the end of what we know of as chapter 6, he kind of gives a summary, right? And then he pivots into assortments of what you might consider traditional wisdom sayings that cover a wide range of perspectives on wisdom. And not all of them appear to be in agreement with one another. And in the section we're going to look at today, which covers from chapter 6, verse 10 through chapter 7, verse 24, he comes to a very unsatisfactory conclusion, for me anyway. But let's start with chapter 6, verse 10, 11, and 12. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and that he's not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity. And what's the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? This is our pivot point here. He has looked at all these things. He has found that, for example, the more words you assemble, the more vanity comes of it. You could say that he says more talk is of less benefit. But what do you think he means when he says whatever has come to be has already been named? Well, many people, when they read this, they think back, of course, to Genesis, where God sets the first man the task of naming all the creatures. And whatever he names them, that's then what their identity becomes. Throughout the Old Testament, we know that name is more than just a tag put on someone. It is their identity. I think of that poor child at the beginning of 1 Samuel, where judgment comes on the house of Eli, and his daughter-in-law is giving birth to a son when the news comes that the ark of the Lord has been taken and that her husband and his brother have been killed. And of course, this news shocks Eli so badly, he falls over and breaks his neck. And then she's dying, giving birth to this child, and she names him Ichabod, which means the glory is departed. And that's the identity he carries with him the rest of his life. Or you think about Isaiah's children, they have some pretty peculiar names, and they're always object lesson names. But worse than that, Hosea's, well, putative children's names, because he's not sure. One of them he calls not mine. It's just like a name in the Bible is more than just a name. So when Kohelet says whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, there is that sense of everything's been identified, right? He's already said there's nothing new under the sun. Everything has been identified. It has been given its character, including humanity. And part of the character of humanity is that they are not able to resist God's sovereign power. Of all the things that humans can do, that's the one thing they can't do. And this will come back around in a little bit. But you see where this pivot point is going. He's been through all the explorations of different ways of living. What's worthwhile? What makes a good life? And he's like, you know what? Everything that is known. We're known, and we have our limits. And the more you talk about it, the less it's worth. And that's no advantage either. It's like there are certain people where you just know they like to talk, to hear their own voices. The more you talk with them, the less sense you get, because you just keep going round and round and round and round. They just like to talk. But the question he comes up with is a really good question. Who knows what is good for man while he lives? And some people would like, who knows? I don't think Koheleth is saying it that way. There is one who is stronger than humanity. He knows. He also knows what will be after mankind when he's done with this life. Which brings us into perspective. This first section of wisdom sayings deal pretty bluntly with wisdom's perspective. So starting in chapter 7, we see that a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. You might say that Koheleth is advocating a permanent front row seat at the funeral. And people will say, why? It's so morbid. But that's what he says. This is the end of all mankind. And wisdom takes perspective from that. A number of people look at this and draw instant connection with Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. But part of it is, you are everlasting, we are dust. When you get to verse 12, he says, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. And Koheleth agrees. If this is the end of everyone, then everyone needs to come to grips with that fact. And then look at life and say, what will be of value between now and then? And here again, we run into that bit, right? That no one can dispute with one who's stronger than he, that God has his plans, and we don't know when that day will be. So it's not like you can just pop into one funeral and go, yes, everyone dies, and then go about your merry way. Every day we live with that possibility. Today could be the day. And wisdom takes that fact and says, how then do I live? Been reading through a book of 17th and 18th century Puritan prayers, shall we say. And just recently I came across one that said, basically, if today is to be my last day, Lord, in your grace, make it my best day. That's very much in harmony with what Koheleth is saying here. Because you remember, he said a good name. And remember, name is not just a name, but a character. A good character is better than the most precious ointments, right? To us, that's like, well, ointment is cheap, but not necessarily. Prescription ointments, not so much. And you think about in the New Testament, that one lady who broke the alabaster flask of ointment, and they were appalled because it was so expensive. A good character is worth more than that. A good death is worth more than a good birth. We get obsessed with, sometimes, lineage. You think about how many people are enamored with the royalty of the UK, right? That's what's known as a good, being of good birth, right? You have good background, usually comes from wealth, usually comes from power. But he's saying a good death is worth much more than that. You can't control where you're born, to whom you are born, how you. None of this is in your control, but through wisdom, a good death is. And so he says, yes, take a front row seat at the funeral, because you look at that and you say, when my day comes, and until my day comes. And when he says sorrow is better than laughter, think about how much more we learn, how much more God refines us through the griefs we suffer. We don't like it, we don't appreciate it, but responded to properly, grief is a valuable thing. If nothing else, if we respond to our losses in life with increased trust in God, with a softened heart, more compassion, more grace for others, then we've been made better. People who live, you might say, on the surface of things, where everything goes well and they go for what they want, never really think about it, they tend to be rather hard, rather brittle people. But wisdom is found more in the response to sadness than in laughter. And that's even just like, good, natural, wholesome laughter. Don't get him started on the laughter of the fool. We hit verse 5 and we pivot away from necessarily this contemplation of our mutual end to the perspective of good sense, you might say. 5 and 6 talk about it's better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools, right? To be scolded by someone who is wise has the chance of setting you more firmly on a path of wisdom. But to listen and you just, right? The song of fools, right? Generally speaking, this reminds me at least of the carousing type of singing. And you think about, oh, fun, pleasure, a good time. And Kohelet says, yeah, and what do you get from it? Well, one thing you get from it is to be dragged away from the path of wisdom. But be scolded once by a wise person and take it to heart, and you're moved forward. And then he adds to this, as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This also is vanity. I don't know how many of you ever start a wood fire, but you can't really start a wood fire with the good firewood. You need something flimsy, easily combustible. Thorns make good tinder. But if you ever try to sustain a fire made merely out of tinder, you are going to have problems. It's going to go out really fast. It's the fire consumes it. There's no substance to it. It's just there to get the more substantial wood time to catch fire. And he talks about if you have your fire, your cooking fire out camping, that's made entirely of these flimsy little pieces of kindling, what good is that going to do if you want to cook your supper? None. And so he says, is the laughter of fools. And then his favorite word, right? This is vanity. So there's one sense of a perspective, right? Wise rebuke is better than the foolish frivolity. But wisdom, right? Even wisdom possessed can be lost. Verse 7, oppression, and we're not talking the wise people being oppressed, but the wise people becoming the oppressor. Corruption, you might also think, drives the wise into, well, the ESV says madness, but some translations will say folly or senselessness. And a bribe corrupts the heart. So you can have wisdom and you can lose it through unrighteousness. Perseverance and patience, he says, are better, right? Wiser than pride, anger. Verse 8, better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools. Basically, it takes up its residence in the hearts of fools, whereas the wise, they're patient. They show some forbearance. We're going to see this again come up in a little bit. But there's this idea that I tend to be one of those kind of people who starts things and then kind of leaves them off because it's hard to continue. It takes discipline to bring a thing to completion. And he says, the end of the thing, bringing it to completion, is better than its beginning. Because only when a thing is completed is it actually suited for its purpose, whatever its purpose is. And patience goes hand in hand with perseverance. And in this section of sort of perspectives, he gives a really sharp jab at the concept of the golden days of yore, right? And we all fall into it eventually. When we stop looking as much toward the future with hope as we start looking back toward the past with longing and regret. I wish I could go back. But he says, don't say, why were the former days better than these? It's not from wisdom that you ask this. One commentator said, looking back is doubly pointless because not only does it accomplish nothing, but it prevents you. It really prevents you from accomplishing. Because when you're stuck in the past thinking, oh, how much better it was back then, you're not looking at the future and saying, what can I do now? In fact, you have no real motivation to do so. It's akin, really, to despair. And so he says, don't do it. It isn't wise. And here we come to, right, another point of wisdom, that, wisdom, prosperity, and adversity. Starting in verse 11, he says, wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. The advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. And right, this is a fairly commonplace wisdom of the world that, honestly, wisdom with money is much better. You think about how many ways money protects a person. For one thing, it protects against the elements. And at a certain point, it begins to protect against unwanted human contact. You think about things like closed communities, members only clubs, elite organizations. But wisdom, he says, is more of an advantage because it preserves life. But money, by the way, is far more likely to endanger life because of those people who want the money you have. But wisdom doesn't have that disadvantage. But then he says, consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has twisted, what he has made crooked? So in the day of prosperity, be joyful. And in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Now, going back to the idea that humanity's great weakness is that God is stronger, God is sovereign, and we have no power to resist his sovereignty. We are, in a way, at the mercy of his providence. And the way you approach that is shaped by how you view God. Who do you know him to be? And this is good advice that, when your days are prosperous, when your days are good, rejoice in what God has given you. When your days are full of adversity, consider what God might be doing with you. Because he has made the one as well as the other. And this phrase, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him, it reminds me very much of the Tower of Babel story, because humanity got really full of themselves and decided that they knew better than God, of course, and that they would actually, build themselves a ladder straight up to him, to stand on equal footing. And he said, nope, not going to happen. I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen. So he confused the languages. And then they couldn't understand what anyone was saying, and it all fell apart. The more we try to control whether our days are prosperous or not, as the case may be, I think the less we understand, the less we're able to understand what God intends for our days. And so we spend our time just, headlong, eyes shut, really, charging against the wall that we've decided we need to break through, when really, in the end, it might be that wall that's protecting us from something. It might be that wall that, we're meant to follow along until we find the door that God has open for us. So it is better to take each day for what it contains and acknowledge that God makes all kinds of days. And only He knows what comes next. And here we hit probably the hardest part of chapter 7. No one seems to be able to agree on what the next 4 verses mean. Well, here's what they say. In my vain life, I've seen everything. There's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand. For the one who fears God will come out from both of them. And people go, wait, what? What do you mean, don't be too wise, too righteous? And some people say, well, he must be quoting a type of righteousness or a type of wisdom advice that says, just go for the mean, go for the middle ground. Don't try to be too goody-goody, and of course, don't try to be too evil. But this doesn't really seem to match the rest of the book. And there are some people, I read one that tried to make this out to be more the legal sense of righteousness, like my cause is right, and said, well, the people who always insist on being right, well, they'll end up destroying themselves. But the people who, and he took the wickedness part to be bearing up under suffering without insisting on the rightness of your cause. And I'm like, wow, that puts some acrobatics into the interpretation, doesn't it? My favorite, I think, commentary was, it's hard to understand. And no one really understands it. Like, that's honest. But where else has he talked about righteousness? Well, think about the beginning of chapter 5, where he talked about guarding your steps when you go to the house of God. And it struck me, and I don't know for sure, right? I can't say that this is so, but I started to wonder, is this over righteous? Don't be overly righteous or too wise. Is that somehow connected with this sacrifice of fools from chapter 5, where it talks about people who, instead of obeying God, offer shallow sacrifices, not knowing that they do evil, who think that it's more righteous to make these vows, but then they're backpedaling and not keeping them. Which then made me wonder, is he talking about legalism? This overly righteous, I can, win my way with God, prove myself good, and then license the wickedness, the folly. Because that last part, the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. And of course, right, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So the wise man avoids both extremes. Now, that's not saying that the wise man never tries to be holy, but it does suggest to me that the wise man avoids this legalistic righteousness that says, I will be good. And then, of course, the license that says, well, God will forgive me anything. I'll leave it to you to think about that. But in a world that often turns upside down, where wisdom dies young, righteousness perishes, and wickedness lives on to a increasingly wicked old age, I would say the middle ground of humble submission to God, listening and obeying, is probably the wisest. Because again, we don't know the day, we don't know the hour. And I had a thought this morning. Sometimes I get lost in thought. Like, for instance, when I'm showering, I just kind of like, oh yeah, what was I doing? I was thinking, trying to think how to say it. But yeah, the idea that I had one of those moments where you're like trying to grab hold of a thought and it just kind of keeps slipping away from you. Maybe I'll come up with words for it eventually. But the advice from 718, it's good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, meaning stick to the middle ground. Hold on to righteousness. Even though, right, he says later, right, there's not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. But hold on to that as the goal. And hold on also to grace, because you will fail, right? And you can rely on forgiveness. And then the rest of this section is just very sporadic. Verse 19 doesn't seem to connect to anything. Wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Well, right? You've lived long enough, all of you, that you know that civil authority does not necessarily always connect with wisdom. In fact, it seems it rarely does. But wisdom strengthens and gives natural authority to those who might not be recognized as authorities, but wisdom makes them heard. And then 20 through 22 is an argument for forbearance, really. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins, so do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. Essentially, no one's righteous enough. So don't think more highly of yourself than of those who sin against you, because, right, how many times have you offended others? Natural tie to the New Testament, right? Forgive us our sins as we have forgiven those who sin against us. But Koheleth, and this is why I decided to end here, this is a natural summing up. All this I have tested by wisdom. I said I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? It's pretty common. The deeper you dig into things, the more you realize how shallow you are. The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. And Kohelet has hit that moment. It's like, you know what? I decided I was going to be wise, but that was a lot further than I could reach. Not that he's done. By no means is he done. But he will continue pressing against these things, kind of testing them, trying to tap them for wisdom, even though he knows that wisdom is beyond his grasp. But again, we need to take a few minutes for our New Testament perspective. And part of what I think about when I see his struggle for wisdom is the fact that wisdom really needs a focus. You start just collecting sayings and it's just scattered. But I think about what Paul wrote in Colossians, end of chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2, where he talks about, this is right, the mystery, the glory of God's mystery, Christ in you, the hope of glory. And he talks about him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. For this I toil, struggling with all his energy that he powerfully works within me. For I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you and for those at Laodicea and for all who have not seen me face to face, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love to reach all the riches of full assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. We do not just collect bits and pieces of wisdom. We have a focus for our wisdom, and that is to present one another knit together in love, in full possession in the end of the riches of the assurance, understanding, and knowledge of this mystery that has been trusted to us, Christ, our hope of glory. So any so-called wisdom that doesn't lead us toward him is not the wisdom we need. And that, of course, reminds me of James. You want to talk about wisdom, you can't ever leave James out of things. But James points out that there are two kinds of wisdom. And this is James 3, starting in verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. Two kinds of wisdom, the wisdom that comes from above and the wisdom that comes from below. And these will always be in conflict with each other. And you know the difference between them because the wisdom that comes from above, right, is pure, peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. Whereas the wisdom that comes from below, this earthly, unspiritual, demonic wisdom, shows itself in jealousy, selfish ambition, disorder, and every vile practice. So when we talk about pursuit of wisdom, it is important to remember, right, that founding principle that the fear of God, the reverence, obedience, is the beginning of the wisdom that comes from above. Because it is the wisdom that is taught by God. And if you don't respect him, you're not going to listen to his wisdom. You're going to look for the wisdom of the world, the wisdom that inevitably leads to hell. So this is where we will end up. If you would, for next week, read up from 725 through 8. We'll try through 8, see how far we get. Excuse me.